I'm Paul Martin. I was the 21st Prime Minister of Canada, and I brought in the Civil Marriage Act. The principle of equal marriage really begins with the minority rights protections of the Charter of Rights, 1982. The evolution since then, very slow at the beginning, but came to a head not so much in the definition of marriage, but in the protection of the minority rights of those who required same-sex benefits, whether it be in pensions, whether it be in survivors' benefits, which up to that time had not been available. And gradually, as the court cases evolved, the whole question of same-sex benefits rose really to the top. And as such, in Bill C-28 in 2003, the government really brought forth a piece of legislation that protected those benefits. But because the debate over same-sex marriage had by this time really come upon the scene, it was important, if the government was going to protect those benefits, that it make it very clear that that's what it was dealing with. And thus, in Bill C-23, there was a statement that says this does not deal with the definition of marriage. The government by this time was convinced that same-sex marriage had to be dealt with, had to be enshrined, but it essentially wanted to clear the plate for same-sex benefits. Public opinion had not coalesced, and in fact, if anything, within the Parliament of Canada, there was a very strong division between those who would have supported same-sex marriage and those who were against it, and that was reflected among the public. And so that whether you were for same-sex marriage or not, what you wanted to do was to ensure that same-sex benefits passed, which is why, in fact, the government brought in Bill C-23, that Anne McClellan did it, and it passed. In terms of equal marriage, the courts were all over the place. There were courts deciding that equal marriage was on, and there were other courts that were deciding the exact opposite. But after a period of time, one court, that is to say, Ontario having decided in favor, the court in BC, a lower court in BC, having come out against equal marriage, was reversed by a superior court, and then you had both Ontario and Quebec supporting equal marriage. That was very important, and it was at that point that the government then said it was going to make a reference to the Supreme Court of Canada in order to determine that same-sex marriage was in fact constitutional. Let me go back. We have come, first of all, the Charter of Rights, which protected minority rights, and this is a minority rights question. We then had the debate over benefits. Were same-sex benefits to be guaranteed, to be assured, and the government wanted them to be so, and brought in a special piece of legislation which in fact guaranteed same-sex benefits. At that point, the door was now being opened for the whole question about the principle of equal marriage. The government fundamentally, if it was going to go forth, did not want the question of constitutionality to be raised as an objection, and therefore went to the Supreme Court, made a reference to the Supreme Court on that issue. At that point, the election occurred, and I came in as Prime Minister, and the Supreme Court ruled that in fact equal marriage would be constitutional. And I had decided, given the length of time that had really elapsed under this, that the time had come to act. I brought in the Equal Marriage Act, and it passed, and the rest is history. I believe very strongly in the Charter of Canada. I believe very strongly in minority rights. And I believe that this is one of the areas that distinguishes us from many other countries. and is one of the guarantees of the freedoms in this country. It is also one of the guarantees that we are that fundamentally a nation of minorities, which is what we are, have to be able to stand together, and we cannot allow the rights of one minority to be circumscribed without thinking that sooner or later somebody's going to come after us. That's the reason that I think that Canada has the freedoms that it does. It is for that reason that I felt so strongly about bringing in the bill as quickly as possible, enshrining equal marriage. But there are other freedoms in there, and there were those people who were worried about the freedom of religion, and which is why in the same piece of legislation we made it very clear that we were talking here about civil marriage. We were not talking about religious marriage, and that any religious institution, any religion that did not share that view on the definition of marriage would not be forced to do it. That the decision as to whether a church would perform a marriage was up to that church. One province then essentially brought forth the notion that there should be a referendum on this issue. Well, you just think about that. What does the Charter do? It protects the rights of minorities. So if you have a referendum where the majority would oppress those rights, which is what the notwithstanding clause would allow, then basically the true strength, the foundation in this country of the Charter would have gone by the boards. And so I wanted to make it very clear that not only were we not going to use the notwithstanding clause to take away rights, and understand at the point that we brought in this legislation, 7 provinces, the courts of 7 provinces had already okayed equal marriage. So the point that I said is, I'm not being asked here to create a right. I'm being asked to deny Canadians a right that 7 courts in 7 provinces have given. And that's not my Canada. And the role of the government of Canada here is to ensure that rights are extended throughout the country. And that is what I did. That's why there would be no notwithstanding clause, and I made it very clear beforehand. At the time that the Charter was brought in, I don't know if people thought about equal marriage. I suspect not, given that the first battle was over equal benefits for people who are in same-sex relationships. I can't tell you today what are going to be the challenges to our rights in 10 years and in 20 years, but I do know that if this country stands behind the Charter, stands behind the rights of minorities, understands that as a country we must stand together, and that means that we are not going to shift minorities off into a corner and say, you don't have the same rights that the rest of us have. I know that if we stand together, that there is nothing that is going to stop us as a country. And if you take a look at the debate that is taking place in the world, if you take a look at the way, in fact, populations are being penalized, are being shoved off into a corner, if you take a look at what's happening in Venezuela, then you can understand that really the principles that have built this country in the last 50 or 60 years are the principles of the future as well. And we must never, never jeopardize them. I am very proud of the Civil Marriage Act. I'm very proud of it for the reasons which I have stated. But it is not my legacy. It's Pierre Trudeau's legacy. It's because he brought in the Charter of Rights. And I'll tell you who else's legacy it is. It is that countless number of men and women over the course of the last 30 or 40 years have not been afraid to come out of the closet and say, this is who I am, this is what I'm about. Their courage in really saying, I am prepared to take you on, to tell you what I'm about, tell you what I can contribute, I think is something that has to be recognized. It's easy today to talk about equal marriage. It's easy today to talk about equal benefits. It wasn't that easy 20, 30 years ago. And yet, men and women came out of the closet. And friends of mine, and if I was to say to whom is all of this owed, to whom the principles of this country in this particular case, who are the people who stood up for those rights? It's those men and women who at a time when everything was against them said, I'm going to say who I am and what I believe. Well, what I've said is that the Civil Marriage Act is really based upon the protection of minorities as set out in the Charter of Rights. And in this particular case, equal marriage essentially says that you can be married. That marriage is no longer restricted to a union between a man and a woman, but that same-sex marriage can happen, and that people who are engaged in same-sex marriage can have happiness. That if they did not have that sense of equality, which comes with same-sex marriage, might be deprived. They might be deprived of. But it's also about religion. It's about freedom of religion. The fact is that we made it very clear that freedom of religions is an essential part of the Charter, and that no religious institution would be forced to perform a civil marriage against their will. Some have, some haven't. And it's important to reaffirm that freedom of religion. And that's an essential part of the Civil Marriage Act as well. There was certainly a lot of conversation involved. There were people who, very good people, very fine people who had a lot of difficulty with the notion of civil marriage. But fundamentally, when you talk to them about it, and I spent a lot of time talking, obviously, to members of my caucus and to Canadians about this issue. When you talked about the importance of protecting minority rights, when you talked about the fact that if we were not prepared to protect your minority rights, that in fact it could be your minority rights that were going to be affected. And when you put all of this in the context of our basic freedoms, Canadians understood. And that's why, in fact, the Civil Marriage Act passed. It didn't pass because we simply snapped our fingers. There was an enormous amount of debate and discussion that took place. And the Canadian people themselves were divided. But if you take a look at the evolution since then, it's clear how Canadians have understood this. And what does that speak to? That it speaks to that the next time there is a challenge in terms of people's civil rights, in terms of the protection of minorities, just as Canadians rose to the Charter, then they will rise to the Charter again. I think that Canadians want to do what's fair. I believe it's absolutely crucial from an economic point of view. We're dealing with the youngest and the fastest growing segment of our population. When Canadians understand that if you underfund education, you underfund their health care, and you're underfunding the youngest and the fastest growing segment of your population, that economically that's lunacy. It goes back to our principles, the principles of fairness, and the principles that are enshrined in the Charter. And the best example of that I can give you is the Human Rights Tribunal essentially came down about a year and a half ago saying that the underfunding of child welfare, children in care who are Aboriginal as compared to children in care who are not, is against basically the human rights that have been established. And so that is an important thing to understand. The degree to which where Canadians will really rise is to recognize that the rights of minorities have to be protected. We're not the only country with the Charter of Rights, but more than any country I know, we live it. I think that's really what it is. You see that, you see what's going on in other countries. You see the way that rights are being violated. They all have charters of rights. They have them because there's a capacity for a majority to basically think they've got right on their side, when all it really got is more people. And I think that we've understood this in this country. I think that really makes the difference. And I'll tell you why I also feel so good about that. The conversations that I've had with people my own age who are gay and who told me what it was like for them, in grade school and high school, long before anybody could come out, and the fear that they felt and the isolation that they felt. And I tell you one thing, I am so glad that this issue, we have dealt with it as well as we had long before social media was created. Because when you see what social media can do to somebody, and so I think that, just thank heaven